Joan Russell, Vice President of Travel for the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia, and I welcome you all to our program this evening. Please take a moment before we begin to silence your cell phones and electronic devices. However, we do encourage you to tweet about what you hear this evening with our Twitter handle @WACPhila. The Council is also on a number of other social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, all of which can be accessed from our website. And as usual, we are filming our event and will be posting to YouTube and also sharing with our travelers to Iran. The Council would like to thank the Middle East Forum for help in promoting tonight's event, and we'll welcome its members who have joined us here tonight, and also Iris Bieri, Deputy Director of the Iran Project, is in attendance. Welcome. We also have a student, Nikki Adeli. She's from Science Leadership Academy. She's with us this evening. It is spring break, but Nikki's chosen to join us this evening. We appreciate her being here. Iran, once the East's powerful center of art and culture, has of late been considered by many a radical and repressive member of the axis of evil. However, some argue that the election of President Rouhani offers an opportunity which must be seized to negotiate a diplomatic repair of Iran's relations with the United States and the West, and in particular to resolve the question of Iranian nuclear weapons ambitions. Others argue that the apparent Iranian moderation is a sham, and that no diplomatic solution to the nuclear issue is possible. Joining us tonight is Ambassador Thomas Pickering and Dr. Michael Rubin to discuss these issues. Ambassador Pickering has spoken to a World Affairs Council national audience on many occasions, and Dr. Rubin has spoken to our Inside Washington participants and will do so again in early May. Ambassador Pickering of the Iran Project holds the rank of Career Ambassador, the highest honor in the U.S. Foreign Service. In a diplomatic career spanning 5 decades, he was U.S. Ambassador to Israel, the Russian Federation, India, El Salvador, Nigeria, and Jordan. From 1989 to 1992, he was Ambassador to the United Nations in New York, and he then served as Under Secretary of State for Political Affairs. Earlier in his career, he was Special Assistant to Secretaries of State William P. Rogers and Henry Kissinger. He also served in the U.S. Navy and Naval Reserves. Dr. Michael Rubin is a former Pentagon official whose major research areas are the Middle East, Turkey, Iran, and diplomacy. Rubin instructs senior military officers deploying to the Middle East and Afghanistan on regional politics, and teaches classes regarding Iran, terrorism, and Arab politics on board deploying U.S. aircraft carriers. Rubin has lived in post-revolution Iran, Yemen, both pre- and post-war Iraq, and spent time with the Taliban before 9/11. His newest book, Dancing with the Devil, The Perils of Engagement, which he'll be signing after the event tonight, examines a half-century of U.S. diplomacy with rogue regimes and terrorist groups. We're looking forward to a thoughtful and lively exchange on these important issues this evening. So please join me now in welcoming Ambassador Thomas Pickering and Dr. Michael Rubin.
Thank you, Joan, for that very nice introduction and for your warm welcome. It's a delight to be here with Dr. Michael Rubin. And Iris Bieri, who's with me, has promised that she won't give me my ticket to go back to Washington tonight until I tell you what the Iran Project is. So in 2 or 3 sentences, the Iran Project began in 2001 by a group mainly of retired American ambassadors who believed that it was important and indeed urgent to begin a process of opening contacts between the United States and Iran. It only took us, 2001 to 2013, something like a dozen years. Not a pace of great rapidity, but nevertheless a important and indeed, I think, significant diplomatic development for the United States. We spent a number of years in track 2 dialogues. We spent a number of years in contacting Iranian friends and others off and on, and developed ideas about how and in what way negotiations might be conducted. Tonight, I want to spend a few minutes with you to talk about 3 things. I want to talk a little bit about the Iranian nuclear program and its backdrop. It's nice to have a responsive audience.
I apologize.
No, terrific. I've never gotten cheered so early in my secondly, I want to talk about the first agreement that was reached on November 24th of 2013. And then I want to talk about progress and some of the challenges in the comprehensive agreement currently being negotiated. My hope is that on that basis you will understand something about what are the difficulties of dealing with Iran, but also some of the prospects, indeed, in some of the issues involved in doing so. Iran had a nuclear program under the Shah. It had grandiose objectives, probably somewhere deep in the Shah's mind, and not so far from the surface was the notion of nuclear weapons. The program was stopped at the time of the revolution, begun again after the long war between Iran and Iraq in the 1980s, and moved ahead fairly rapidly, including Iranian development of enrichment, a technology which of course has dual purposes. It can support civilian activities, including the production of electrical power, and it also can create uranium of a high enough level of enrichment to be usable in nuclear weapons. The Iranian program itself has been the centerpiece of U.S.-Iranian concerns, if I can put it that way. U.S. and Iran have, of course, enjoyed 35 years or 34 years of separation, certainly deep and pervasive mistrust, and in many ways fueled at times by misunderstanding. We have been at loggerheads. We have been in combat against each other in one way or another. We have also joined together to try and establish a government back in 2002 for Afghanistan and in a number of other areas. So it has been a checkered, a difficult, and in many ways trying, and certainly in some respects frightening relationship for the United States as well as Iran. The Iranian nuclear program certainly over the years has caused us a great deal of problems, particularly between 1998 and 2003, when it is clear that the Iranians did a deal with the Pakistanis through the so-called father of the Pakistan bomb, Dr. A.Q. Khan, obtained certainly enrichment material, early stage centrifuges and perhaps more, some allegations including even a Chinese design for a nuclear weapon. That period saw Iran engaged in a number of activities which were clearly well beyond the breadth of any defensible civilian program, including activities that were certainly related in one way or another to research toward a nuclear weapon. Since 2007, the United States intelligence establishment has concluded on an annual basis, including this year, that Iran has not made a decision to manufacture a nuclear weapon. That particular conclusion is also echoed by the Israeli intelligence establishment. But what is clear that Iran over the years, through its civilian program and its activities between 1998 and 2003, has been able and continues to be able to develop a sufficient technology, capacity, understanding, and knowledge that should a decision be made to manufacture a nuclear weapon, it would be capable of carrying out that decision. And certainly that's an important and very significant conclusion about their program. It is also important to note that over the years, significant efforts have been made to try to negotiate with the Iranians on a solution of one kind or another to their nuclear program. There have been different positions and different ideas. Certainly, the ideal position would be to have no nuclear program in Iran. The next ideal position would probably be to have no enrichment in Iran and no production through other facilities of plutonium. Both uranium from enrichment and plutonium can be used to manufacture a nuclear weapon. Indeed, they are the essential commodities. Over the years, it of course would have been nice to have had an Iranian program that was so fully circumscribed that it presented no danger. And of course, the United States, in my view, has always had the right position on Iran. The only difficulty is that it generally has been 5 years too late. And so at the moment, we are now engaged in a negotiation as to whether and how a civilian program in Iran can be conducted compatible with a significant amount of time available should that program be misused to break out to nuclear weapons. The Iranian attitude toward dealing with the United States in a negotiated effort on their program changed. Prior to that, we had a series of meetings. The negotiating partners on one side were Iran alone, and on the other side, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany. Over the years, for most of that period, the US did not participate. It was only in the last months of the Bush administration that we began to do so. Those meetings generally were conducted once or twice a year with a large amount of negotiation ahead of time to fix the time and the date and the place. Often the meetings lasted no more than a day. Each side explained their position. That was rejected by the other side, and we went back to negotiate the time and place of the next meeting. There was an Iranian presidential election in the summer of 2013. 6 candidates were approved, one of whom was Mullah Rouhani. He'd been associated with the nuclear program. He was educated in Glasgow. He ran on a platform in Iran, quite surprisingly, that Iran ought to be once again reintegrated into the world community, and that it had to deal with Western concerns about its nuclear program if it was going to achieve that objective. In large measure, that was produced, I believe, in part by his predecessor, President Ahmadinejad, whose name you all now know, mishandling of Iran's economic life in a very devastating way, plus the very significant contribution to real hardship in Iran on the economic side by the sanctions program, instituted both through the United Nations Security Council and as well by the United States and the European Union and others unilaterally. And so the process was set up for a negotiation. Interestingly enough, for a number of years, the Obama administration had expressed very publicly its interest in having bilateral discussions with the Iranians. The Iranians had consistently rejected those. In 2013, before the Rouhani election, through Oman, there were bilateral confidential discussions started between the United States and Iran. They seemingly prospered. They may well have sent a signal to Iran that a negotiation was possible. Certainly the supreme leader of Iran has traditionally exercised a great deal of skepticism about that process, but nevertheless it began. That process came to a head in the negotiations in the autumn of 2013, with all of the partners playing a role, which ended up creating something called a joint plan of action. The joint plan of action was essentially an arrangement under which Iran agreed, in my view, to very severe limitations on its ongoing nuclear program on the one hand, while the United States and others agreed to relax sanctions, in my view, in a very careful and indeed almost cheese-paring way on the other. All of us who had been dealing with Iran over the years, and indeed I think many others, if they had been asked 3 months before the joint plan of action was concluded on November 24th, 2013, had been asked if we could get anything like that kind of deal, I think you would have collected a lot of money if you voted against it with them. It was in many ways a very interesting agreement. It did a number of things that I think it's useful to keep in mind. One, it got Iranian agreement to stop enriching material to 20%. And indeed, over the next 6 months, to in fact immobilize and take away their stockpile of 20% material. Half of it was blended back down to 3.5%, and the other half was converted to a form which is not readily upgradable through an enrichment process. Certainly requires a lot of time and a lot of loss of uranium in the process of doing so. But many other things were also involved in that agreement. A commitment not to enrich above 5%. A commitment not during the life of that agreement to produce any more low enriched material, 3.5% material, than they had at the beginning. All of this under IAEA, UN inspection teams, and all of the inspection processes were improved. Certainly for the first time anywhere in the world, the IAEA inspectors had daily access to the Iranian program. For the first time in the world, the IAEA began to inspect not only the enrichment program and the program designed at the end to produce plutonium, but also the manufacture of centrifuges, including essential pieces like manufacture of the rotors. The UN began inspections on a regular basis of uranium mining, not conducted anywhere else in the world, and the operation of preparing uranium ore prior to enrichment, not done anywhere else in the world. And so there were a number of very important forward steps. The UN has access to all of the known Iranian facilities that are engaged in sensitive activities in the nuclear program world. Two aspects of the joint program of action are very important. One was that the next step would be a 6 months effort to design and negotiate a comprehensive agreement, about which I'll talk in a moment. And the second was very important, that the comprehensive agreement would be based on a mutually agreed definition of an acceptable Iranian civil program. Very significant, because it defines the parameters under which Iran will continue to be able to conduct nuclear activities, and they have to be linked to a civil program. Very, very significant effort, because it opens the door to a comprehensive agreement, which can at the one and the same time be limited. As a result of this joint plan of action, Iran was able to have made available to it over the 6 months in 6 tranches $4.2 billion of its own money, money that had been previously locked up in banks as a result of sanctions. Certain sanctions were removed on things like aircraft spare parts, petroleum imports, automotive spare parts, and other activities of that sort, but in a very limited way. The comprehensive agreement started its negotiating process in January. There have been 3 meetings at high level and a number of meetings at the technical level. The first part of the discussions has been just that, a discussion of how each side viewed a comprehensive agreement and what should be done. The comprehensive agreement negotiations made early progress in the first meeting with an agreement between the 2 sides of the scope and the nature of a final agreement. The subsequent 2 meetings discussed all aspects of the Iranian program, including limitations on enrichment, and indeed how and in what way to deal with the reactor Iran was building to manufacture plutonium. Now the hard part starts. Iran and the United States and the other negotiators have agreed that the negotiations will begin in the next meeting, which should take place within the next 2 or 3 weeks. There we will begin to see whether real progress can be made. An agreement on a comprehensive program in Iran will have 5 parts. Limitations on the amount of low enriched uranium that can be produced, as I said, linked to Iran's needs, which in any legitimate civil program will be very sparse. There are clearly differences between both sides on that, and that will be a tough and difficult negotiation to bridge over. Limitations on plutonium. That seems to have made better progress according to the reports that we have, that both sides have agreed that in one fashion or another, the reactor that seems to be designed ideally to produce military plutonium will be converted to a different type of reactor, which is much less capable of producing military plutonium. And so hopefully that will slow down, if not stop, that particular area. There will be discussions between the IAEA and Iran on what actually happened in Iran between 1998 and 2003 in their military research program. There will be a tightening of inspections to cover all of these activities, and there will be, and the hardest part for those of us who are not Iranians, will be how and in what way will sanctions be released on the basis of a significant Iranian commitment to real limitations on their program. This is a tough set of questions to deal with. Many of us are skeptical that it can be completed by July 20th, the 6-month anniversary. But the agreement has a provision that it can be extended by mutual agreement. That in itself will not be easy. The terms of an extension, and indeed how and in what way it should proceed, will themselves be controversial. I've just spent 3 days in Israel, had talks with 25 Israelis about the Iranian negotiations and where we're going. 3 of us came back, 2 former ambassadors and a nuclear proliferation expert, with a very clear idea in our mind of what their concerns were, as indeed does the U.S. government. Not all of those, I think, will be satisfied, but many can be. And I think that from what I heard when I was in Israel, there is a sense, particularly at the senior official levels, and indeed among many experts, that an agreement might well be possible, despite the fact that their asks are going to be significantly larger than what the U.S. has. But my sense is that we came back with a fairly clear idea that where there were gaps, some of them at least could be bridgeable. So let me leave the point there with you. Real progress has been made in the last year, well beyond what many of us expected. We don't know what the prospect is for the future. There are significant and very difficult issues to deal with, and I look forward to conversation with Dr. Rubin, and perhaps we can touch on some of those particular issues as well. But thank you for the time. It was a great pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador. There's much with which I agree with the Ambassador. There's much with which I disagree. But rather than start the discussion now, what I want to do is focus on the issues at hand from a slightly different perspective. Admittedly, I'm a historian, so I get paid to predict the past, and I'll acknowledge I only get that right about half the time. But one of the issues that is so problematic with regard to Iran has to do with questions of sincerity. And ultimately, as the Ambassador implied, this is something that we're only going to know in hindsight as we look forward to some key deadlines moving ahead. When Hillary Clinton became Secretary of State, she talked about how you don't conduct diplomacy just with your friends. I mean, you conduct it with your adversaries. That's what diplomacy is for. And she pointed out that Ronald Reagan sat down with Mikhail Gorbachev to help negotiate the end of the Cold War. What she didn't mention in that context is that came after a multi-year military buildup in order to set the right circumstances for success. Now, shortly before, the Iranians agreed to come to the table in this preliminary deal, which after 6 months, or perhaps after an extension, is to lead to a permanent resolution. The Iranian Central Bureau of Statistics released a report in Persian, which had said that Iran's economy had contracted 5.4% over the previous year. Now, the question which we then have as the Iranians move forward with negotiations is whether they are interested in a resolution to the nuclear impasse, or whether they're interested in having the immediate sanctions relief with their funds unfrozen, and when one considers additional investment which has poured into Iran, estimates vary between $7 and $20 billion. If the Iranian goal has been to have that immediate sanctions relief, then ultimately I would draw an analogy to, it's like giving a 5-year-old dessert first and then asking him to come to the dinner table to eat his spinach. Now, here's the problem when we negotiate with Iran and when it comes to Iran's sincerity. ultimately, there's a few issues here. One is the statements of the Iranian negotiators themselves, although not necessarily in the last 6 months. For example, during the Ahmadinejad era, before President Rouhani came to office, there was a great debate between those who followed the more reformist line and those who followed the more principlist line about what the proper strategy for Iran should be. Hassan Rouhani, of course, had been a nuclear negotiator under Mohammad Khatami, and he was often taken to task for having once suspended Iran's uranium enrichment. What he responded in Persian to his critics was, the reason I did this was so that I could control the timeline, and at the same time, we needed extra time to install some of the additional technology. In this case, it was the centrifuges back in 2005, so we needed to suspend some of the enrichment anyway. Likewise, Hussein Mousavian, who's also a reformist who's been making the speaking rounds, has said in Persian, and I believe he also had written this in the New York Times, or else it was in his book, regardless, his book was published in English, that when it came to negotiations, North Korea was a model to emulate, rather than a system to condemn. And in this case, we know, of course, that everything which North Korea has today, whether it's with regard to their nuclear program, their ballistic missile program, or with regard to what U.S. intelligence community believes are crude nuclear weapons, they have achieved against the backdrop of a diplomatic process simply because they didn't negotiate sincerely. Now, Albert Einstein had a quip that the definition of insanity is doing the same action repeatedly, but expecting different results each time. Between 2000 and 2005, when Mohammad Khatami was president, and he was a reformer, of course, the European Union decided that they were going to try to embrace Iran and try to bring them into the world community by furthering trade with Iran. And so in that period of time, you had between Iran's trade with the European Union more than double, almost triple, according to both Iranian statistics and European Union statistics. The so-called reformers in Iran subsequently bragged, and this of course is under the presidency of Mohammad Khatami, that they took 70% of that hard currency windfall and put it into Iran's nuclear program, which at least before 2002 was covert, and the ballistic missile program. Now ultimately that also raises the question of sincerity, as does a speech which Hassan Rouhani gave on February 9th, 2005 in Mashhad to a collection of the Islamic Republic's leadership. In this case, he outlined the history of US-Iranian relations and argued that at every critical point, Islamic Republic had triumphed because of a doctrine of surprise. You lull the West into complacency, and then when they're not expecting it, you do the unexpected. And ultimately, this is also one cause for suspicion. Now, this isn't a reason not to negotiate, and this isn't a reason to condemn diplomacy. The issue is, however, whether the process is enough at this point in time, and whether the checks and balances are enough. We have other issues of sincerity. One of the items that has given great confidence with regard to the most current round of negotiations is the discussion, the implication that the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, the successor to Ayatollah Khomeini, has blessed the nuclear talks. And indeed, he spoke about heroic flexibility. That's what was reported in the West. What was not reported in the West was what was said in Persian the next day in the Iranian press, in which it was explained by those around Supreme Leader Khamenei that heroic flexibility represented a change in tactics, not a change in policy. And indeed, that has been reiterated over the last couple days, I think just 2 days ago, on the Supreme Leader's own website with regard to the red lines which the Iranian negotiators should not cross, which among them is walking back any of the progress which the Islamic Republic has made to date in the nuclear program. Now, when you negotiate, of course, it's important to make sure that you are negotiating with the people that have the ability to make the concessions or to make the deal that that is the purpose of the negotiations. And certainly, I will assume that Hassan Rouhani is now sincere. I'll just concede that for the time being. The problem is that in the Islamic Republic of Iran, the presidency is more about style than it is about substance. The real power in the Islamic Republic has actually become the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Oftentimes in the news media, people will talk about Iran's nuclear program, but that's woefully imprecise because they don't ask who would have the command, the control, and the custody over that nuclear program. Should the decision be made, and I would agree with what the ambassador said, just in agreement to facts, that the Islamic Republic has not made the decision to go that extra step. Now, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, according to many estimates, now controls up to 40% of the Iranian economy. Because after the Iran-Iraq War ended in 1988, they decided that they didn't want to go back to the barracks. They enjoyed their elite position, and they became very involved in civilian industries under what's called Khatam al-Anbiya. I mean, Khatam al-Anbiya, which is the economic wing of the Revolutionary Guard you can think of, and I say this analogy without any moral equivalence, as a combination between the US Army Corps of Engineers, Bechtel, and KBR, all rolled up into one. Iran is the third largest dam building nation on earth, and it's Khatam al-Anbiya that has a monopoly over the dam building. Let's say we come to a deal tomorrow, because I think we can all recognize that the Revolutionary Guard is much more of the problem than the Iranian people. The Iranian people are far more moderate. And actually, while very nationalistic, I would say they are quite desperate to return to the international community. Well, you have a situation where if the official budget of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, as many people estimate, is only about $5 billion per year, and that's really not much. In the smuggling income across the Persian Gulf and the Wooden Dowels, you have about an additional $13 billion per year. Under Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the former president, the important thing about Ahmadinejad wasn't simply his rhetoric, his Holocaust denial, and all of that. He was the first Iranian president who came from a military background, rather than from a clerical background. He gave about $55 billion worth of no-bid contracts to Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps companies, which means even if we strike a grand bargain tomorrow, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' budget is taken to zero, in effect, they're facing less of a cutback than the United States is through sequestration. The United States military, that is, proportionally. And so ultimately the question isn't whether we can reach a deal with Hassan Rouhani and the Iranian Foreign Ministry, but whether such a deal could be implicated by the powers in Iran that control this. And certainly when at the end of the Bush administration, I believe it was Undersecretary Burns, sat down with the Iranians in Geneva, while there was a great deal of backslapping among Iranian reformists and frankly among many American diplomats, the Revolutionary Guard issued a statement that this shows that the Americans will withdraw beaten and humiliated. And so ultimately that is a problem, not necessarily an insurmountable problem, but a problem that needs to be addressed as we move forward with diplomacy. Because while diplomacy is certainly better, I mean, no one really wants military action on Iran. And everyone largely agrees with what the consequences of that would be. As I said before, I personally am against bombing Iran. And the reason is, at best, you're going to have a 2 or 3 year delay. And the question then becomes, and you're going to have a heck of a lot of reverberations for having conducted that military action. You're going to rally the Iranian people around the flag. You're going to justify Iran's desire and need for nuclear weapons. You're going to unleash proliferation throughout the region. There will be asymmetric response through terrorism and so forth. We can all agree on that. But if you do have that 2 or 3 year delay, the question is, do we have a policy in place to take advantage of that delay? And if the answer to that is no, then ultimately I'd argue it's an irresponsible use of the US military to simply kick the can down the road. Now, in a previous discussion, we outlined other issues which are now off the table because one of the costs of diplomacy is in order to keep the process alive, oftentimes other issues, for example, human rights and other things get taken off the table. And according to Amnesty International, the rate of execution in Iran has skyrocketed since Rouhani came to office. we can argue that's not in U.S. national security interests, and so I'll put that aside. But for example, we missed previously, because of our desire to have engagement with Iran, the fact that you had a Lech Walesa moment in Iran where for the first time they were able not to have an official labor union, but an independent labor union that wasn't under the control of the government. It was like 1981 in Solidarity, but this time we ignored it. Likewise, we have stepped back in our discussions about how Iranian political development might occur. And ultimately, the question is whether we are, in effect, throwing a lifeline to a regime which arguably was struggling, as we've seen in 2009, to keep its head above water. Now, there's a lot of other reasons for suspicion. And Iran mines uranium, and they say they want uranium for indigenous energy supply. They don't want to be dependent on anyone else. The problem is they say they want 8 nuclear reactors. And if you consider the uranium which they mine naturally, and people have a good sense of how much uranium there is, simply because we were present in Iran for so long, there's public geological surveys, and if you enrich that Iranian uranium to low enriched uranium enough to fuel a nuclear reactor, then ultimately you have enough nuclear fuel to power 8 reactors for 15 years. For about 1/3 of the price, you can upgrade Iran's refinery network and its gasoline pipeline network and fuel their country for more than a century. So ultimately, that's one question. Another question that also impacts on sincerity is why the covert status, why the refusal to come clean on what, until 2003 with the National Intelligence Estimate, was experimentation with things like nuclear bomb triggers. Likewise, we're not talking an intelligence foul-up like in Iraq, because all the intelligence is coming from the International Atomic Energy Agency and their reports. And I would urge all of you to go on the IAEA website and look at the inspection reports. And the reason why this crisis has escalated and in 2005 was taken from the International Atomic Energy Agency to the United Nations was because the Iranians kept getting caught in lies. These centrifuges are all indigenous. Well, in the next inspection, we detected uranium metal, which doesn't have an energy role. Oh, well, we got that from Pakistan. And then you have an explanation. So ultimately, that is another question. Then, while I have a good deal of faith that the IAEA will do a good job, the devil's always in the details. And the IAEA, by its own charter, isn't allowed to inspect undeclared facilities. If there is overwhelming intelligence that there is a covert nuclear facility that the Iranians haven't come clean on, the IAEA is not allowed to send inspectors there. That most recently came into the news back, I think, in 2007 or 2008 when the Israelis bombed a covert Syrian plant. The IAEA had not been allowed to send inspectors there, period. And so ultimately, you have other ways in which you can upgrade the inspections regimen. One of the things that shocked me is when the IAEA installs remote cameras in facilities. I always figured there was some guy sitting at a monitor somewhere looking at that 24 hours a day. Those cameras, the film is taken, I think, every 17 days or so, back to Vienna where it's reviewed, and then it's not a 24-hour process, and then the question comes, what might Iran do in those 17 days before we're aware, should they want to break out? And the last thing is, what does a breakout mean? What's the difference between a nuclear weapon, nuclear weapons capability, and having a nuclear weapon? And frankly, that can be as little as a week or two, once the Iranians make the decision. And while we may disagree on what the intelligence could be in such a situation, I'm not sure whether we would have the insight, once the Iranians make that decision, to be able to follow through. To be frank, other countries are in the same situation. Japan, for example, which is a turn of a screw away from becoming a nuclear power, but frankly, I worry a lot more about Iran than Japan. I think both of us have outlined different perspectives, and hopefully we have a great deal of fodder for discussion as we move forward. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We're going to take questions. If you could realize that there will be a lot of them, so if you could make your questions succinct, I'll take the first people to raise their hands. Okay. I'm going to take this microphone over so you both have one. We don't have 3. But Trudy, would you like to ask your question?
Trudy Rubin, the Philadelphia Inquirer. Just on the questions of on the question of the Revolutionary Guards, it's clear Rouhani has only been given the mandate to deal, and Zarif only have the mandate to deal on nuclear issues. That has been made clear. And the Revolutionary Guards, General Soleimani, basically control the regional politics. Do you think that that division will impede reaching a final deal, in that it's so hard to focus only on the economic when stuff is going on in Syria and elsewhere? And do you think if there is a deal, that that separation will somehow be blurred, and that there's any way that regional issues will then be on the table?
Let me, if I can, take the first crack at Trudy's very good question. Before I do, I just want to point out three comments on the end of what Michael had to say with respect to the nuclear negotiations, because it's important to understand this. There is no basis for an agreement on traditional IAEA access. The basis for agreement is something called the additional protocol, which allows access to the very sites that Michael described, and I think that that's important. I think, secondly, let me leave that aside, because there are other points that Michael made which I think are going to be fully part of an agreement that are well covered here. And I don't need to go into excessive detail on the nuclear stuff, except to point out that what you have picked up is old stuff. It has nothing to do with the negotiating process and where the negotiations will go. Certainly what will be the result, I hope, will close those loopholes in a very serious way. On the question that Trudy raised, I think it's very important to remember that it was the United States, beginning in the Bush administration, who insisted that the negotiations had to cover the nuclear program. That was the serious and most, put it this way, palpable threat to all of us, and a program where we didn't want to introduce a lot of other factors, because there was deep concern that we would end up paying in the coin of other factors for progress or lack of progress in the nuclear program, and vice versa. To get Iranian capacities to change their human rights attitude, they would demand more concessions on the nuclear program. And so it was very clear that that's the way we headed. It was extremely interesting because the Iranians resisted that all along. They wanted to talk about all these other things. And it was clear that the negotiations, even before we joined them, were going to be broken on that particular issue unless the Iranians changed. What was clear was when Rouhani and Zarif, his foreign minister, came to New York in September of 2013, they said to us, look, you had us in the doghouse for 8 years under Ahmadinejad. We're not going to be there any longer. We're going to put on the table a proposal that we think is eminently possible for us to do, and that we want sanctions relief, and that's what we need. And he said, if Rouhani and I can't get that, we're not going to be here next year. And so that's, in a sense, what happened. I was shocked and surprised that it happened that way. And so there is very clearly, Trudy, a deep sense that at some point fairly soon, if the nuclear question can be resolved, and on its own for the very good reason that we don't want to be in a position where we are using the nuclear program as a bargaining chip to achieve other kinds of objectives, then I think there's no question it will move into further discussions of those kinds of issues. Over the years, people have looked at Afghanistan, where, interestingly enough, the United States and Iran have some ideas in common. Neither of them like the Taliban, for example. In Iraq, where we have other ideas in common, where in fact the Iraqi Shia majority is close to Iran, but I don't think they're the servants of Iran in this particular issue. In both cases, our military action produced great benefits for Iran. They got rid of their two best enemies, Saddam Hussein on one hand and the Taliban on the other. at least momentarily. So there are areas for potential future overlap in the direction of moving from one set of negotiations to the other. But my deep concern has been nuclear. I think nuclear needs to be dealt with. It needs to be dealt with as nuclear. And we need to do everything we can to get the best possible deal and to use the pressure of sanctions and their continuation. Certainly, there's been no let-up on sanctions, despite the predictions that you heard in Dr. Rubin's speech that somehow the Iranian economy was now flourishing. It isn't, I can assure you. And indeed, our sanctions still control all of the banking and financial movements to Iran. None of that has been taken off. And that's important because it's obviously a point of leverage in the negotiations, which the Iranians have been quite frank in saying to us they're concerned about.
Okay, we have some points of disagreement here. First of all, I believe it was 2 days ago, the Iranians announced that their gasoline exports have gone up 258% since the discussions have started. This isn't just in the realm of sanctions relief, but actually the ability of the Iranians to attract investors in the wake of that. Now, there are safeguards with regard to some of the sanctions, and certainly it would be a psychological shock if the sanctions were once again tightened, but it's questionable whether the international momentum will lead that, and frankly, the Iranians will oftentimes talk quite openly about that. One of the causes for suspicion, and I would disagree that this isn't old hat, that the Iranians simply haven't been reborn, that we simply don't start with a blank slate. They certainly don't look at us with a blank slate either, is with regard to the additional protocol. In short, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty had governed the development of nuclear technology. Under Saddam Hussein in Iraq, before Desert Storm, Iraq had something like 11 or 13 clean bills of health from the IAEA. I'm not talking the most recent war, I'm talking back in 1991. And then it turned out, after Operation Desert Storm, after the liberation of Kuwait, that the IAEA had determined that Iraq had been cheating all along. So they wanted to tighten this, but when you've signed a treaty, you can't simply change the terms, and hence the additional protocol. What the additional protocol did is when you signed it, you got additional technology sharing. And when you ratified it, then heightened inspections kicked in. One of the reasons for suspicion with regard to Iran is they know the letter of the law. They signed, but they didn't ratify. To be fair, nor did the United States. Now, you have a situation, however, that doesn't change the fact that if it's a completely undeclared facility that Iran wants to deny exists, the IAEA, even under the additional protocol, isn't going to be able to inspect that. Now, when it comes to the surrounding community, I agree that the Iraqis aren't puppets of the Iranians, the Iraqi Shiites. I was actually in Basra when the elections occurred, and one of the stories I heard in Basra, by the way, which you can see Iran from across the Shatt al-Alam, from across the waterway, is on June 4th, they were opening a new bridge built with US money across the Shatt to the Iraq. At that point, the Iraqis are actually on both sides, but you can see the lights of Khurramshahr in the distance. And the Iraqis decided to open this. This is a Shia area on June 4th. And the Iranian ambassador came and said, you can't open it because June 4th is a day of mourning. That's when Imam Khomeini died. And I mean, the quip on the street at the time back in 1989 was there's a heat wave going on. The old man was so senile, he forgot to close the door on the way down. At any rate, the Iraqis responded by having a fireworks display on June 4th that could be seen all the way into Iran. That said, the Iranians have taken a much more pragmatic approach when it comes to Afghanistan and when it comes to the Taliban. I was in Mazar-e-Sharif, Afghanistan in 1997 when the Taliban attacked the city. And I actually met with the Iranian diplomats who ended up getting massacred the following year. There's no doubt that they mobilized and almost went to war. But if you look at Ham Sharif, for example, which is the Iranian equivalent of USA Today, it's a mass circulation daily that you get free in hotels. It's pretty colorful. Their analysts have said, why shouldn't we arm the Taliban if it keeps the Taliban and the Americans fighting with each other? When it comes much more direct, and of course the Taliban shadow governor in Kunduz in Afghanistan was seized with Iranian bank books and evidence of direct financial complicity there. In fact, since 2001, the Iranians have decided, rather than simply to work with the Shiites and the Persians in Afghanistan, that they were going to take an all-of-Afghan approach. And that's why they've become active in Kandahar and RC East, into the eastern Afghanistan as well. Now, when it comes to Trudy's question, when I was in southern Iraq, people would joke, forget Rouhani, the real president of Iran is Qasem Soleimani, the Quds Force commander, and ultimately this goes back into that whole issue of command and control. You can have a division, and with certainty you are going to have spoilers among the hardliners in Iran, even if the rest of the Iranians are sincere. After the dialogue of civilization started, under Khatami, they invited American businessmen to come to Iran, and a busload of American businessmen in 1998 was set upon by Iranian vigilantes answering to the Basij, answering to the paramilitary group of the Revolutionary Guard, who basically wanted to throw a wrench into American-Iranian negotiations. So, given that we don't have a crystal ball, we can disagree with what our predictions are. But the one thing I would strongly suggest is that if this deal appears to go through, you are going to have Iranians affiliated with the Quds Force trying to throw that sort of wrench into it. The other issue, when I'm on aircraft carriers, one of the questions I'm always asked is, what is one of the big analytical signs, tells, that the Iranians might be up to something bad? Now, Iran is an oil economy, and a woefully inefficient one at that. It has nothing to do, or very little to do, I should say, with the sanctions. I mean, even before the sanctions picked up, you compare Turkey and Iran, Turkey without oil, Iran with oil, who had the better economy? Turkey, hands down. And that's because Turkey didn't mismanage in the same way that Iran did. But you have to make a budget. And you have to predict what the price of oil is going to be to make that budget in order to make your payroll. If the price of oil starts going down, let's say below $90 a barrel, which is what the central bank said the current budget is set at, then you have an Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps commander say, I hereby forbid the USS John C. Stennis strike group from transiting the Strait of Hormuz. They don't have to drop a single mine into the Strait of Hormuz. What happens to the price of oil in that case? It goes up. So you're not only talking about ideological enmity, you're also talking about the fact that Iran doesn't have commercial law. It has a very poor economy, and oftentimes these sorts of nationalist maneuvers on the part of the IRGC or elsewhere are a way in order to keep the Iranian economy afloat.
Another question. Yes, one in the back. You.
Hi. Sorry to throw a wrench, but I just came back from Kiev and Moscow and Sochi and Turkey. Why would Iran give up nuclear weapon after Ukraine gave up nuclear weapon in 1994?
Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon.
No, but they will. But why would you give that up for your national security, number one, especially since Russia's had a history against Persia, and also the United States invasion of Iraq? I could see where the Iranians said we have to secure our national security, our national sovereignty. But why would you know what I'm saying? After what Russia's done, why would anyone?
Both Israel and President Obama have said they're not going to permit Iran to have a nuclear weapon.
I understand that part, but
And that's not, that's not something that's trivial. Secondly, in return for thinking that in fact they're going to make a nuclear weapon, we have put a very devastating monkey wrench in their economy. And over a period of time, people do have to pay attention to the public, even the Ayatollah. And so that's moving ahead. Interestingly enough, the famous General Soleimani, about which you've heard a lot of things about, good, bad, and ugly, actually worked with us to facilitate the early days of our activity in Afghanistan when we moved in, obviously, to take over. And there was a very clear conjunction of effort. And so the famous General Soleimani also has other interests at heart. Not that I think he's changed, but I do think overall, Iranians, including the famous General Soleimani, know what's in the best interest of their country. I also think, and I think both of us agree on this, that if Iran were to get a nuclear weapon, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, if it had the capacity still left, the United Arab Emirates would all move in that direction, and some believe indeed that the Saudi Arabians have already paid in Pakistan for their nuclear weapon. They're just waiting for delivery. Whether that's true or not, there are obviously ways that that could move ahead. None of that is very good. I think finally, the one thing that I think, or the two things that all states who get nuclear weapons seem more or less to come to the same conclusion on is, one, when they get a nuclear weapon, they don't want anybody else
anywhere in the world, big, small, or otherwise, to have a nuclear weapon. Secondly, and this is the real quandary, they have no real idea what they would ever use it for.
Just one item, I think they're very good questions, and I'll just leave it there. But in 2006, there was actually a poll released from a Tehran think tank, which was quoted in Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Iran report, in which usually when you have Iranians polled about their nuclear program, it will be done in the context of, do you believe that we have a right to a nuclear energy program? And overwhelmingly, Iranians will say yes. This was the only poll I've ever seen conducted inside Iran by Iranians. Would you feel more secure if Iranians had nuclear weapons? And overwhelmingly, by a 2/3 margin, Iranians said no. That think tank was subsequently closed down.
Do you think that even if Iran gets a nuclear bomb, which seems possible, they would be so suicidal as to even try and use it and accept the loss of Tehran from corruption and any other big city?
Let me give you the nightmare situation. The nightmare situation, I don't think the Iranian regime is suicidal. Here's the nightmare situation, however, and it goes back into the command, control, and custody of any potential future nuclear weapon. It would likely, I think it's a pretty solid guess, that it would be controlled by the Revolutionary Guard, and for all we spend on intelligence, one of the big unknowns is about the factional divide within the Revolutionary Guard. We talk about reformers and hardliners in politics, but the Revolutionary Guard isn't homogenous. But I would hazard to guess that that nuclear weapon, if Iran developed one, would be controlled by the most ideologically pure unit of the Revolutionary Guard. Now here's the situation. What happens if you have an uprising caused by some random spark? In 1999, it was the defenestration of a student. In 2001, it was with regard that the Iranians had thrown a soccer game against Bahrain so that men and women wouldn't be celebrating together in the streets. In 2009, it was over election fraud. What happens if you have a situation where you have an uprising, but instead of the Revolutionary Guard putting down that uprising, some of the units actually join in? So you have a situation like Romania in 1989. And many of you remember that on Christmas Day 1989, Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife, Elena, ended up before a firing squad. If you have a situation where you see that the regime is going to collapse in 12 hours anyway, and if you have been given this, if you become the guardian of this bomb for the simple sake of your ideological purity, but you know you're dead tomorrow anyway, what's the ideological hesitance to utilize that? And that's where the traditional concept of mutually assured destruction, or for that matter, containment, break down.
And I could totally agree with Dr. Rubin. The fundamental basis of American non-proliferation policy is the simple proposition that the more people who have it, the more danger there is of accidental, miscalculation, misjudged, controversial, whatever you want to call it, potential for use. And once you break that line, you obviously are opening up what is clearly worse than a hornet's nest. Certainly a huge potential for national and international catastrophe. And there are people around who say, well, why don't we let so-and-so get a nuclear weapon? Why don't we just lie back and enjoy it and relax? And I think that this is a significant issue. We have tended to look at bad actors, as we have seen them, as the worst possible candidates for nuclear weapons. I'm not sure that that necessarily should be the only guiding principle of our objection to nuclear weapons. And over the years, we have had success in places like Taiwan, in Korea, in South Africa, which had nuclear weapons and got rid of them. Not because it necessarily believed in non-proliferation, because there was a total change, obviously, in governance in South Africa, and the new people who came in saw no use for them. But these are, in my view, very important pieces. And there is no question in my mind, regardless of whether you believe Iran is domestically so unstable as to allow nuclear weapons to become a kind of football in the hand of factions of the Revolutionary Guard, or whether you just feel that they're in continued uncertainties about the potential for use. Both of those argue, certainly very strongly, against having proliferation. Very strongly, in my view, and I think we're both agreed on this, that we should try a negotiating route because the other alternatives don't seem to be very effective and have a great deal to say about downsides. Certainly, early military action against Iran, as Dr. Rubin has said, is unlikely to produce anything in an enduring way to stop a nuclear program on the one hand, and require constant revisits, if I could put it this way, of military action to continue it. But in my view, and in the view of many who watch this, give the Iranians that plausible reason for, in fact, making the decision to go for a nuclear weapon, because they've been attacked without having a nuclear weapon. And those are all very difficult questions. But your question is an extremely apt one, and I think a correct one to look at, but certainly one that I would argue very, very strongly. We should not, in Iran or in Timbuktu, take chances on further nuclear proliferation.
I'm just going to build on that for a second on one point which I think on this hypothetical we would actually agree on, and the issue is that if Iran were to develop this weapon, that it's not simply the use of the weapon which becomes problematic, but rather that Iran would have its own nuclear deterrence against which to lash out conventionally through terrorism, realizing that no one could then retaliate against them. But one issue on which we might disagree, and I just want to build on this, has to do with the question of taking military action off the table. Now, one of the episodes in my book that I look at is with regard to the hostage situation, and to me this is a case in point about why military action shouldn't be taken off the table. In 1979, of course, the seizure of the American embassy wasn't simply because people hated America. In fact, the Americans were a backdrop to most of it. It was about factional divisions within Iran. Brzezinski, Carter's national security advisor, went out to Algiers. He shook hands with, I think at the time Iran still had a prime minister, the Iranian prime minister. That was, someone took a picture, it appeared in the paper, and that became the impetus for some radical students to seize the embassy. Now here's the thing. When you actually look at what the Iranian students were seeking, initially they only planned for a 48-hour sit-in. However, loose lips sink ships. There was an American official who came from the White House meeting, emergency meeting, and leaked to the New York Times that military action had been taken off the table. When you go to the Persian language memoirs of some of the hostage takers, they will argue that that became the time when this 48-hour sit-in became 444 days because they figured that they wouldn't have to be accountable. That wasn't directly with regard to your question, but overreaching our discussion, and frankly where perhaps we disagree to some extent, is the idea of whether it helps or hinders negotiations to have that military sword of Damocles looming over.
The good news, I think, is that in that respect, the Iranians would never believe that we were taking military action off the table, certainly under the present regime. And Iranians, whatever their action, certainly was clear that Ayatollah Khomeini was, in his own words, considering taking the students out of the embassy, and found that, in fact, in Iranian domestic political actions, it was not possible to do that, and so we got the 444 days. I also think that somehow Dr. Rubin's forgotten it. The visit of the Shah to the United States had a certain amount to do with Iranian reactions in respect to the embassy.
Well, actually, I think this is a fun discussion. One of the other issues about the cost of negotiations has, certainly with regard to the students, the Shah's medical treatment in the United States was important, but we wanted to reach out, and there's two general schools of diplomacy. One is to engage in the process and hope that that opens doors through which you conclude a deal. And the other, and this has been enunciated by Daniel Kurtzer, a former ambassador to Egypt and Israel, U.S. ambassador, the other is to wait for the right circumstances and then seize them. So the question is, do you make the right circumstances, or do you just wait for the right circumstances? We wanted to negotiate the hostages release, and this is understandable because while we can, hindsight's 2020. I mean, the fact of the matter is, there was a real fear that the Iranians might execute these hostages. And so put yourself in Jimmy Carter's shoes. I'm not here to bash Jimmy Carter. But when we reached out, the first Iranian foreign minister, I think, was Ibrahim Yazdi. And in order to press his revolutionary credentials, He gave a list of demands. He was fired after a couple weeks. And then another Iranian foreign minister got put up there, Sadegh Khubzadeh, and we approached him. And he increased the demands because he needed to prove his revolutionary credentials. And the takeaway from this is if you have an unsettled domestic political situation, sometimes rushing diplomacy can do as much harm as good.
So, just a second. No, we usually ask for questions from students, so Nikki, no pressure. But in the meantime, we'll take Mitch's question and then your question. Thanks.
I want to thank both of you, and I think diplomacy is important, but a couple of things I want to ask you about that I think complicate this. One of them is Iran's support and using of Hezbollah, Iran's role in Syria, and also we referred to the president and so forth. How complicated it is when the president draws quote-unquote a red line in Syria, and there's arguments even after the red line was crossed, we haven't done anything. How does that complicate these scenarios?
I don't think it makes it necessarily any easier. What is quite interesting is so far, and of course you could say Ukraine, Kiev, and Russia, at the moment, and everything moves from moment to moment, the Russians apparently are participating fully in the Iranian effort. I can only think the Russians don't want a nuclear weapon in the hands of a neighbor any more than we want a nuclear weapon in the hands of Iran. But there may be other more complicated arrangements there. Certainly in Syria, the relationship is much more frozen and much more fraught. I think that crossing the red line, if you consider President Assad getting rid of his major deterrent weapon against Israel as something that is a real gift from heaven and not something that counts in any way at all, please believe it. But I think it was, and I think it was a real turnaround. I think Mr. Putin was concerned that he had no real riposte if we had used military attack. I think the president didn't want to use military attack. The Congress was certainly not enthusiastic, and I could tell you that a public without a poll was certainly not enthusiastic about it. So in one way, Putin saved him, in another way, Putin hazarded for at least a while his relationship with his good friend President Assad. What the Russians over a period of time in Syria have said, it's not Assad who counts, we just need to keep a friendly regime there.
I'll be equally brief. Ultimately, I think the red. I have no problem with red lines. I just don't think presidents should issue them more than once every 25 years. They should certainly not be part of a rhetorical stump speech. And ultimately, this isn't a castigation of President Obama because the Bush administration was just as bad at issuing red lines. If Iran doesn't cease enriching uranium by the time of the G20 summit in Pittsburgh, there are going to be grave economic consequences. And of course, months pass, nothing happens. I spent time earlier this winter in Syria, as well as in Iraq, and then Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates. Just a few observations. First of all, wars in the Middle East aren't caused by oil. And despite its academic trendiness, they're not caused by water either. They're caused by overconfidence when one side doesn't understand the interests and the fortitude of the other side. We saw this after the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah, when after it was over, Hassan Nasrallah got on television and said, if I had known how the Israelis would have reacted, I never would have conducted this operation in the first place, the attempted kidnapping of some Israeli soldiers. With regard to the confidence in the region, you know, what happens in Crimea, what happens in Syria doesn't stay in Syria. What happens in the Crimea doesn't stay in the Crimea. One thing we need to recognize, while oftentimes people talk about the good of globalization, is that rogues, and when I use the term rogue regime, I'm actually borrowing Bill Clinton's term. Again, it's like that Potter Stewart Supreme Court quip about pornography. It's hard to define, but I know it when I see it. But Tony Lake, Bill Clinton's national security advisor, actually wrote a piece in 1994 in Foreign Affairs defining rogues as basically undeterrable states that didn't agree to the norms of diplomacy. When you have situations like that, inaction against Iran, inaction in Crimea, not that I think there's any possible action we could have taken when push came to shove, certainly has reverberations in Korea, it has reverberations elsewhere, and we see this actually in the writings of various strategists in Korea, in Iran, in Venezuela, when they point to examples that occur.
In regards to the Iran's nomination of Hamid Khalifaladi, what do you think is the Iranian government's intentions in addition to weakening the outcome? And you know, coming up, do you think they're going to put someone, they're going to nominate someone else?
I'll repeat the question. Iran has nominated a ambassador to the United Nations whom many Americans allege has been involved in the hostage taking, although he himself and other Iranians say no, he was just a translator at the time. Let me put that aside and go into the analysis. I would argue that this is a sign, and we talked about this in response to Trudy Rubin's question, no relation between the two of us, by the way, that there are those inside Iran who want to throw wrenches into the process in order to spoil it. The Quds Force has one way to do it. The nomination of this gentleman to be ambassador is another way of doing it. How it plays out, I don't know.
I don't disagree with you. I think that the U.S. made it very clear that Mr. Abu Talibi would be a real problem for the United States in issuing a visa. They said it as clearly as they could, as privately as they could, but warned. And so either Rouhani was overruled, which seems likely, by factions that wanted to throw a monkey wrench in, and it was allowed to go ahead. And it isn't going ahead because I think the full weight of the Congress at the moment is resisting that, and it's highly unlikely the U.S. will move ahead. What is interesting is it could have never happened anywhere but the UN. And that's because no ambassador ever goes to the country to which he's appointed without the private agreement of that country long before his name becomes public in a process that has a French name, agrément. It means essentially agreement to receive. So all of the 195, 200 countries of the world that exchange ambassadors go through this process. In the UN, it doesn't seem to work. The UN has not got the capacity, even if it's asked ahead of time, and I believe it is, to say we don't want Mrs. X or Mr. X. And so that's a weak point. And in many ways, what we are doing is perfectly consistent with the way in which we handle ambassadors' nominations from any country in the world. It's a mistake, in my view, on the part of the Iranians to try to send somebody who will ring all the alarm bells in the United States that this guy is wrong, despite the fact that he may have only been an interpreter. He nevertheless engaged himself in at least doing the translations and the interpretations for a number of the hostage takers at a very early time in the process, and so he's tainted. I don't think he's a leader, I don't think he's an inspirer, probably didn't carry a weapon, all of those things. The real question is, can you cure yourself of that particular ill? And the answer I have to say is, of course, but not now in the United States, in the current emotional state in which we are engaged, and the deep distrust over those 34 years of Iran. I would have to tell you that if we sent to Iran as an ambassador, if and when that ever comes, somebody who was on the Vincennes. Do you know what the Vincennes was? Vincennes was an American cruiser that shot down an Iranian civil airliner. I think quite mistakenly, but 200 and some ex-people were killed instantly by the crash of that airliner. And it was no threat except that it was flying on its regular route, and the Vincennes happened to be there. But if we sent somebody who was on the crew of the Vincennes, we would never get agrément for him in Iran for all of the same set of reasons. And so it's a messy problem, it's a difficult one. We ought to find a way to put it behind us, but there is no easy way. We'll have to refuse formally to issue a visa, or maybe just let the process stew for a while until the Iranians send us a new name, or send the UN a new name, which will come to us.
Things like this are even difficult among allies. The USS George Washington, which is based in Japan, our carrier there, our aircraft carrier is going to need to be refueled in a couple years, and refueling a nuclear carrier takes many years to do. So then the question becomes, what carrier strike group are you going to send to Japan to take over, what is it, 7th Fleet? And there's no way in heck we're going to send the USS Harry S. Truman to Japan. But these are the types of discussions that go on even among allies.